Chapters 33 and 34 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. Suppose one were to lead a starved beggar to a loaded banquet table, and then give him $10 to persuade him to sit down. The mood of Sheriff Claney, as he stared at the canvas sack, was the mood of the beggar. He had his first clue to the whereabouts of a criminal whose apprehension would not only restore his vanishing prestige, but would even raise him up on a higher pedestal than before. To try and fail is human. To try again and then succeed is glory. Sheriff Claney felt that his lean, strong hand was extending toward the green wreath. This time there would be no question of escape. If he came in range of the outlaw again, it would be a matter of lead and powder and buzzard food left behind. Dead, he was worth as much as he was worth alive. But in addition to all this, to have a sack of $5,000 added for his personal use. He rubbed his hands. For the first time since the jailbreak, the heart of the sheriff was warmed. But as for going to the saloon keeper and gambler, and thrusting the $5,000 into his hands, this was not at all to the liking of the sheriff. He had another idea which was fully as good. As long as the correct information were exacted from Carroll, there was no good reason why the money should not remain in hands which would use it to far better advantage. He went straight to the saloon with the gold in a valise. "What's in it?" was the gambler's first question. "Something I can't get here. Good booze." The quip did not please Carroll, but he regarded the sheriff with a calm eye. If Claney had known parts of the gambler's past, certain parts which Jess Dreer, for instance, could have told him, he would have put a gun to his head before he would have taunted such a man. But he ran on. "I've come on an unpleasant errand to-day, Carroll." "Mostly you don't come on no other kind of errands. What's on your mind?" "To put it to you straight, your games are on my mind." "My games are straight." "Of course you've got to say that." "It's true, Sheriff." "I've been hearing stories. Let me see. There was a gent that blew through town, little squat, fat, half-breed sort he was. Said you was working something that looked like a brake on your wheel. What about it?" The gambler flushed. "I had a fool working for me. That was 6 months ago. He came to me and showed me how he could fix up the wheel so it would make a pile of money for me. I told him I wasn't running that sort of a game. He thought I was kidding. I told him straight. But I took him on and give him a job. He was busted. Well, he was a snake. He knew how much I'd been used to making on the wheel. He fixes up a brake on the wheel, and of course he busts the boys for a great big percentage. He gives me what the house used to make right along, and he sneaks the rest of it into his pocket. In about a week I went over and watched the wheel one day. Seemed to me it was running queer. That night I looked it over and found the brake. I called in Tommy, gave him the licking of his life and $100 for luck, and sent him on his way. That's the only crooked thing that there's ever been about my house. I would have paid back the boys that lost their money, but how could I find 'em? And if they knew I was paying, would they have told me just how much they lost? No, there was nothing I could do. Besides, I didn't get the coin. It was the thief that done that. So there you are, Sheriff, and that's the truth." There was no escaping from the sincerity of the man. "It's the first time that I've ever been even questioned," he said gloomily. "That's the point," said the sheriff hastily. "You've been going on so long that some of the boys are kind of suspicious." At this Carroll rose from his chair. "Look here," he said quietly, "what are you here for? Trouble?" "Sit down, Danny, sit down. I'm a reasonable man, and I got your interest at heart. You'll see that I have in a minute. Right off I'm going to tell you that what some folks is kind of riled about. They don't like the sort of gents that you bring in and put up at your rooms, Danny." "My friends is my friends," declared the saloon keeper grimly, "and if you and the rest of the town don't like 'em, you and the rest of the town can go to the devil. That's straight." "Is that fishing for trouble?" said the sheriff coldly. "You know it ain't, but you can take it any way you want. Name some of the gents that ain't been liked." "Jess Dreer." It shook Dan Carroll to his feet. Coming so smoothly, so unexpectedly, it was utterly impossible for him to control his expression, and his staring eyes had in a moment admitted everything. He saw at once that he was exposed. The sheriff had tilted himself back in his chair, and was grinning complacently at the other. "It's a lie," was all he could say, more angrily than effectively. "Hush up, Danny. You done it smooth, all right, and I wouldn't never have guessed it if it hadn't been for one thing, Dreer himself." "Just done that?" muttered the saloon keeper. "He told? I put him through the 3rd degree, Danny, and he busted down and told." Slowly, as though the strength were gradually melting from his legs, Danny Carroll sank into the chair. "He done that?" was all he could murmur. And he stared at the floor. "But I didn't want to ride you about it," went on the sheriff smoothly. "I'll tell you why. I like you, Carroll. You look square to me, and I didn't see no good in making trouble for you for shielding an outlaw." He paused to let the words sink in, then went on. "But now things are different. Dreer is gone from jail. I've got to find him. And I come to you and say, Dan Carroll, you know where Jess Dreer is. Tell me." As he spoke the last words, he leaned over and thrust his fingers under the nose of the other. Dan Carroll raised his eyes slowly from the floor. "Sheriff," he said, "I dunno. But if Jess is a hound, then I'm worse than a hound, and no matter what he's done to me, I still got to stand behind him. And if I knew where he was today, you couldn't drag it out of me." "Carroll, go easy. I could bust you. It'd be a black case agin you. First a charge of using a brake on the wheel." "Would you scrape that up?" "Business is business. First the brake, then this shielding of an outlaw." "You can't prove it." "I'll swear you've admitted it. Besides, I can prove anything on a gambler and saloon keeper. You ain't got a chance." Perspiration broke out on the forehead of Carroll, but he shook his head stubbornly. "Me and Jess has been pals. Go ahead with your dirty work. I won't blab on him. Besides, I'm tired of talk, Sheriff. I need a drink." "So do I," admitted the sheriff, "but I'm not through." Carroll sighed and settled again into his chair. The strain had been great, and he was weary. "There's one thing I want to bring up in your mind, Danny. If you lose this place, you lose a lot. You wasn't no church-attending saint a few years back, but you reformed, you settled down, you played square, you got a place for yourself in Salt Springs, and people trust you. You're willing to risk all that in order to shield Dreer? I'll tell you why. It's because you've had some bad luck, Danny, and you've blowed so much coin that now you ain't got any more than a fingernail grip on your saloon." Inspiration struck across the mind of the sheriff. "Carroll, who brought you the bad luck? Who busted you mighty near? It was Dreer, playing with you every night." And the gambler nodded gloomily. "Now listen to me, partner. Will you talk turkey?" "Not in 1,000 years, Sheriff. I'm busted anyways." The sheriff paused. He had worked hard to save the money for himself, but Dreer meant more than money to him. He pointed to the satchel. "Pick that up." The gambler obeyed. "It's dust. 5,000. Carroll, that coin belongs to you if you talk." The big hand of the other tightened on the grip of the satchel. "He's north," he said huskily. "Windville." Then realization of what he had done rushed on him. He hurled the bribe to the floor. "You skunk!" he cried. "Take the coin. I don't want it. Besides, I told you wrong. He ain't in 1,000 miles of Windville." But the sheriff stood at the door, smiling. "Keep the money, Danny, and I'll keep my word. So long." He was gone, and Dan Carroll dropped into a chair. "Jess," he whispered, "it kind of busted out. I couldn't help it. Forgive me." Chapter 34. But the retirement of Jeff Claney was purely a feint. He understood perfectly that if he had remained another moment in the room, he would have had the money hurled at his head, with a bullet behind it, perhaps. He knew also that temptation is like whiskey. It needs time to work. It goes down raw, and makes one shudder with repulsion at first taste. Afterward a glow runs through the body, and fire mounts to the head. The world is seen awry. In other words, the sheriff waited until the gambler had had time to estimate the value of that gold. He waited until Carroll, having finished the count, would have made up his mind to retain the satchel and its contents, for the sheriff was sure that once the man had actually fingered the contents he would never let them go. In exactly 1 hour the sheriff returned, and at a single glance he knew that his purpose was accomplished. The glance of Dan Carroll was no longer straight and solemn. It flicked here and there, and there was a glitter in his eyes that pleased the sheriff enormously. Dan Carroll had no word to greet Claney, but the latter had seen at once that the satchel had been removed. It was locked in the gambler's safe. It was also locked in his heart. He had estimated the sum, he had counted it, it was already a part of his life. Before the sheriff he backed into a corner and stood there like a savage animal, able to tear its keeper to shreds, but held in awe of the trainer's whip. This simile occurred to Sheriff Claney and made him smile. He enjoyed such scenes as this. Just as a chemist loves to watch some sturdy amalgam melt under the touch of an acid, so the sheriff looked through the eyes of Carroll and saw the disintegration of his soul and his honor. After the opening pause, the sheriff laid his cards frankly upon the table. He talked in a very businesslike manner, not as one who is opening a proposition, but rather as one who has already reached an agreement and is now merely giving the details a final summing up. He told Carroll what was wanted of him, not persuasively, but as if a refusal would have astonished him too much for words. He counted off his points on the tips of his fingers, and he kept looking at his hands instead of at Carroll's face, for he knew that if he did the latter, shame might undo all that he had accomplished with talk, threats, and money. After all, it was settled very briefly. 1 hour later Claney went back to his office in the jail and sent for Gus Norman. The latter came at once, and was met with this question: "Can you give me a man with an eye in his head and a tongue he can keep from wagging too much?" "Open up," demanded Gus Norman, "then I'll tell you." "I will. Here's the way it stands. I'm not going to tackle Jess Dreer in Windville." "That's where he is?" "It is, and I know the hotel he's living in. I guess they ain't more than one hotel there, for that matter. But I don't want to tackle Dreer in a town where he's known and where they's mostly his friends. I want to get him off by himself, then I'll gather him in." "That takes time." "And I got the time to put in on it. I understand he's fixed fine in Windville, and won't be apt to leave for a long time. Windville is so far in the hills that it don't hear nothing about what goes on in other places. It ain't ever heard of Dreer, maybe. Anyway, he's showing himself open up there, and everybody's for him. That's what Carroll says. First, I want to send up a man and make sure he's there, and then give Dreer a letter." "To tell him you're coming?" asked Gus Norman dryly. "It's a letter from Dan Carroll," said the sheriff. Gus Norman gaped, and then the two grinned in silent enjoyment. "My boy Joe is the one for you. He's just up and around, and I guess he ain't got any reason for loving the Valentines, and them that stand in with the Valentines. I'll bring Joe to you. Besides, riding is his long suit." And Joe Norman was brought. He was a very short distance into his 20s, a dark, handsome boy. His eyebrows met in a straight black line, but the eyes themselves were rather wide and weak. His chin, too, was of Grecian roundness and strength, but his mouth lacked decision. He was the sort of youth about whom one would not venture to predicate much that was good or much that was bad. He obviously needed ripening. 10 years would tell the tale with Joe Norman. He had taken one great step toward full manhood in the past month. He had stepped up and faced his first gun fight without flinching. He had felt the tear and burn of a bullet through his arm, and now that he was himself again, the experience had fully doubled his self-reliance. Into his hands the sheriff, after a moment of explanation, delivered the letter, and the next morning, in the early dawn, Joe started north. There were 2 ways to Windville. One was a straight cut through the mountains, a journey uphill and down dale, dipping into little valleys where there were miserable ranches, and rising again to rocky heights. It was a leg-breaking short cut. The other means of approaching the town in the mountains was by no means simple. It would have wrecked the staunchest buckboard that was ever built, but it did not embrace half as many precipitous drops and back-breaking climbs. It was 50% longer in time and 100% less in effort. So Joe took the roundabout way. He was a skilled judge of the strength of a horse, and he handled his mount so well that he reached Windville a short time after dark. He went straight to Windville's one hotel. Not that this was any imputation against the size and wealth of the little city in the hills, but Jack Turner had gathered most of the business of the place into his own hands, and he had built this rambling structure, which contained blacksmith shop, general merchandise store, hay, grain and wood, saloon, and hotel, all in shed after shed, shack after shack, story after story, a confused jumble of which the proprietor himself did not know half the details. It had grown up in the course of 2 or 3 generations as wildly and as freely as if it had sprung of its own strength and its own volition out of the rocky soil. To find a man in this place was like finding the proverbial needle. Joe Norman went straight to the source of all information, the bar. And to guide his inquiries he had only one bit of information: Jess Dreer was a gambler. It was an old situation that met him in the saloon. 2 men were doing the spending. One stood at one end of the bar, each trying to set up more drinks than the other, and each drawing his own crowd of followers about him. Joe Norman instantly took a place in the exact middle, neutral ground it might be called, and there he remained while the bartenders served several rounds of drinks. He kept his own first drink untasted on the bar before him, and presently this sign that he wished to speak privately across the bar was noticed. The saloon keeper approached and lent a hasty ear, for he was perspiring with his labours. "Is there a game running around here?" he asked. "Sure," and the other nodded and lifted his eyebrows as he made the reply. "Go straight back. First door on your left. You'll hear the noise where you start going down the hall." The first impulse of Joe Norman was to follow this advice, but it occurred to him, as singular indeed, that Jess Dreer, no matter how bold, should be sitting in at so public a game. So he remained standing at the bar with his drink still untasted, until the bartender bent close to him again, this time with a frown. "Anything wrong?" "Nope, but ain't there a game where I won't hear the noise?" The bartender returned no answer. He scurried down the bar, and presently he flashed a keen glance at the stranger. "Harry," he called, and to another man in a white apron he said, "Take my place for a minute, Harry. I see a friend." He came from behind the bar. Joe Norman had already taken the hint, and retired to an obscure corner. "Now, who are you, and what do you want?" was the first query. "I want a game, partner." "Sure you do. But why?" "Because I got a friend sitting in on it." "Who?" "His name don't matter," said Norman cautiously. "Well, he's a tall gent, 3 inches taller'n me, broad shoulders, long pair of arms, long, lean face, steady sort of eye. Know him?" The bartender continued to dry his hands on his apron. He said, "And who'll I say is here?" "No name. Just tell him that a friend has got a message." "Give me the message, then." Joe Norman hesitated. It might be that this fellow knew nothing, but he had to take the chance. Looking the bartender squarely in the eye, he smiled and waited in silence. It seemed that this smile meant many things. "Oh," murmured the other. "Oh, that's it, eh? Well, come along. Maybe he ain't right, but I'm no mind reader." He led past half a dozen little flights of steps, through many a crooked hallway, and came at length to a door which was totally black. No edging of light showed around it, yet on this he rapped. After a moment it was opened a little, and the light burst out. Joe Norman saw now that the edges of the door were padded with felt, the better to shut out light and sound. From within he saw nothing, heard nothing, except the subtle whispering of card on card as some one dealt swiftly, and the fall was deadened by the cover of felt on the table. It was the most exciting sound Joe Norman had ever heard. In the meantime the bartender was conferring with an unseen man at the door, and in a murmur. At length the door was closed, and he turned to Joe. Come here. He'll see you in the next room." He led the way to a dingy little square room, with no light except a smoky lamp in a corner, and there he left the spy. End of chapters 33 and 34. Chapters 35 and 36 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. The sound of the door closing was to Joe Norman curiously like the click of a trap which held him in. He had been rehearsing his part all during the long ride of that day, but now his mind misgave him. It might be that Jess Dreer had seen him in Salt Springs. It might be that even the bartender had recognized him. That might have accounted for the sideways rat look that the latter cast at him from down the bar on the occasion of his second question. At any rate, obeying a sudden impulse of panic, he hurried back to the door and tried the knob. It was locked. The blood rushed back upon the heart of Joe at that. There was a tingling at the roots of his hair, a deadly coldness on his face, as though a breath of night wind had struck him. They knew him, then? He stepped lightly to the window. It was open, but there was no gallery across it. Below him was a sheer drop of how much he could not well estimate in the darkness. 30 feet, perhaps. He was trapped beyond doubt. He felt something behind him now, something impalpably taking hold of him, and when he turned, he found that Jess Dreer had silently entered the room and stood at the other side of it, rolling a cigarette. He had never seen Dreer before. He had been refused admittance to the prison. But how could he tell that Dreer had not seen him? The rolling of the cigarette might mean anything. Perhaps the outlaw wished to appear careless at the very moment when he was striving most to throw the other off his guard. But there was no mistaking the man. He fitted so closely with the description of the broad shoulders, the singularly long arms, the active fingers, that Joe Norman felt he had seen a photograph of the man, that he was remembering the lean, long face. "How are you?" the outlaw was saying. "You got a letter for me?" "Yep," murmured Joe. He was wondering if it had seemed suspicious having been found at the window in that manner. "Let me have it, will you?" And with the same gesture in which he lighted his match, he nodded toward the table. On the table, accordingly, Joe put the letter, and it seemed to him that while one eye of the tall man dwelt on the burning match, the other was fixed on the visitor. Presently he inhaled the first deep breath, and sauntered to the table. He paused with his hand on the letter. "I dunno whether I know you," he murmured. "You don't, but maybe you'll find my name in the letter." "You know what's inside?" "Nope, but I think he put my name in it at the bottom." "How'd you know?" "I asked him to." The outlaw hesitated another moment, and then ripped open the end of the envelope and shook out the contents. He raised the paper. It was infinitely instructive to Joe to watch the reading of that letter. The tall man seemed totally absorbed in the contents, but he had raised the paper high so as to catch the lamplight over his shoulder, and with his back eye to the light he was in a position to keep his visitor in the corner of his eye. By a certain tenseness about the face of the man, Joe knew that he was doing two things at once: reading on the paper and reading on the face of his messenger. A month before, the thing would have unnerved the youngster, but during the month he had looked death in the face, and now, setting his teeth, he waited calmly for the end. And this is what Jess Dreer read: "Dear Jess, I'm breaking the rule and sending you a letter. The reason why is that there's a big deal ahead. I know it's not your system to team it with anybody, but I thought maybe you'd change your plans for a bunch of my friends. They want you bad. Here's the idea. They got a can of money spotted. They got some experts with the soup and can openers, and they'll have the whole job staked out. But if anything goes wrong, they want to have a good fighting head along to take charge. That's why they want you. They'll let you in deep, 1/3 of everything, and 9 chances out of 10 you won't have to lift a hand. If I thought there was any call for you to get mixed up in a scrap, I wouldn't send these boys to you, but I think the thing is dead easy. Also, there won't be any widows and orphans made out of this job. It looks like such a good thing that I had to let you in." Here's another thing. You can trust these gents the same as you would me. Just say the word, and they'll tip you off to what's coming. The chief thing is to get a gathering place staked out near Windville. The idea is for you to find the place. Then one of the gents will go on ahead, meet you, find out where the shack is, and go back and meet the boys, who'll be on the way. It's a neat little scheme, and your trail will be covered inches deep. As ever, your pal, Dan. P.S. The gent that brings you this is one of the bunch, of course. His name is Hank Loomis. You can go as far with him as you would with me. D.C. Over the contents of this letter he cast his glance again, then thrust a corner of the paper into the lamp chimney until the flame leaped, the paper caught, and went up in a yellow blaze. He dropped the filmy cinder to the floor and crushed it to a black stain with his foot. Then for the first time he gave his undivided attention to the messenger. "You're Harry Loomis, are you?" he asked. The word tripped on the tongue of Joe, but he blinked and caught himself in time. "Hank Loomis," he said. "Sure. I guess that was what the letter said. You know me? You're Dreer, I guess." "Sure. Glad to know you. Sit down." "Thanks. You must have known Dan quite a while, huh?" "Tolerable long." "Well, sir, I'm glad to know any old pal of Dan's. Him and me has been pretty thick off and on. Lots of good stuff in Carroll, huh?" "I'll tell a man." The blood was beginning to run warm and free in the veins of Joe Norman at last. "First look at Dan, you'd think he was a sour sort. But he ain't. No, sir. Danny has a sense of humour. Ever hear that story of his about the tenderfoot and the 40-foot rope?" Joe Norman chuckled. "Yep, that's a good story, and there ain't nobody can tell it like Carroll." "That's right, they ain't. Well, old Dan and me has had our times together." "I reckon you have, right enough. I remember one night down to Lawson. But maybe Dan told you about the time him and me rode the old spotted bull?" "Sure. I'd like to died laughing at that yarn. And the way that old bull jumped the fence, and I fell off. Yes, sir, he thought you was a goner. Tell you how it was. We'd been drinking just before. I remember Dan saying you'd blotted up some red-eye just previous, and I didn't no ways have no control over my legs. Well, that's natural enough. But I'll tell you one queer thing, Hank." "Go ahead." Joe leaned forward, grinning. He had heard of taciturnity in this man, and such voluble and friendly talk astonished him. "Here it is," continued Jess Dreer, smiling broadly in turn. "In my time, off and on, I've known some gents with pretty strong imaginations, but I never seen one to match you, Hank Loomis." And as Joe stared at the tall man, he saw that the other's smile was set, mirthless, derisive. "Because you got a pile of ability to remember things that never happened." He dropped his right hand a little, and leaned in his chair, so that he had a perfect chance for his revolver. But Joe Norman made no move to fight. The blow had fallen and stunned him, and he remembered again, for the 100th time, that he was actually in the presence of the slayer of Jud Boone. And how many others? "Speaking personal," continued the big man, "I've known Dan Carroll for a long time, and I've never heard him tell a funny story. And it wasn't me that rode the bull, and Dan Carroll wasn't never in Lawson." The last remnant of his smile was gone. "And so," he said, and waited. Only one thing did Joe Norman see, and that was the bulge and fall of the muscles at the base of the outlaw's jaw as he set his teeth, and he knew that when he faced the levelled gun of Charlie Valentine he had not been so near death as he was now. He was cornered, hopeless. Out of his very hopelessness he found the nerve to do what he did. He leaned back in his chair and laughed straight in the set face of Jess Dreer, and from between his wrinkling eyelids he saw the outlaw wonder. "I'll tell you what, Dreer," he said, sobering, and with a sudden burst of confiding, "I've made a mess of this. I guess I done wrong, but I'll tell you how it was. When the chief wanted to come up here with the letter, I begged him to let me bring it. You see, I wanted to be the first to see you. I sure begged to come, and the old man let me take the letter. It wasn't none too sure he was right to let me go, and now I see that he was right in doubting. Then, when you got to talking, I thought I could bluff you. Well, I was a fool. I don't hardly know Dan Carroll, but he knows the rest of the gang, and he knows I'm straight. Does that clear me?" He laughed again. His very hysteria made the laughter more real. "I sure got tripped up quick, Dreer." The big man rose to his feet. He was frowning, in a quandary, and he stared down at Joe Norman. "Hank," he said slowly, "I sure got an idea that you're double-crossin' me. Dan named you, and Dan's got to be straight. Well, I'm going to take the chance. Take the chance on you, but I tell you now, son, you been near a bad time. But you go back to Salt Springs. Tell Dan Carroll that I don't like this game, that it ain't in my line. He ought to know that. But tell him that I know the luck was agin him the last time we was together. He'll know what I mean by that, even if you don't. And now, if he thinks it would sort of square accounts for me to play this game, I'm his man. I'll do the job. But the profits goes to Danny and not to me. Will you make that clear?" "Oh, sure." "Well, be on your way, then. I guess there ain't any too much time." He held out his hand, gathered that of Joe Norman to the lean, powerful fingers. "Son," he said quietly, "are you straight?" "Why," gasped Joe, "sure I am." The tall man let the hand fall. "I guess you are," he said slowly. "Anyway, you showed a pile of nerve a minute back. Because I meant business. I thought no matter what I thought. So long, Hank." And Joe Norman heard the door close behind him as he turned away. Once more it made him think of a trap, but this time it was closing upon Jess Dreer, and he, Joe Norman, was pulling the levers that closed on the famous outlaw. Chapter 36. In the dawn of the next day Joe Norman took horse and rode again for Salt Springs, with a rested mustang under him, and in the first dark of the night he reached the town once more. A great many things may happen in the mind of a man between dawn and dark, and a very great many had happened to Joe Norman. Vague motions were passing through his small soul all that time, troubling, overwhelming him, almost. For he began to lose the malignant hatred of the Valentines which had spurred him on at first. He was seeing himself in a different light. The whole thing sprang out of the smile of Mary Valentine at that dance. It had gone to his head. It had robbed him of his senses. Then the pang that had gripped him when she turned away from him the next time they met, the hasty word that burned his tongue the moment he had uttered it, then the meeting with Charlie Valentine. And out of that the affair went on into other hands. Still, it was the smile of Mary Valentine that was the starting point. It dazed the boy to think how much had come from flirting with that slip of a girl. It was because of that flirtation that he had fallen, and then to avenge him Jud Boone, the man-killer, had been called in to strike down Charlie, and to meet the power of Jud Boone the Valentines had appealed, through Mary herself perhaps, to a still more dreaded name, Jess Dreer himself. So Jud Boone had died, but still that smile of Mary worked. It was poison running through many minds. Jud Boone was dead, and now the cause was taken up anew. There was another goal, Jess Dreer himself, against whom all the power of the Normans, all the cunning and strength of the law was turned. And what was the cause? Because Mary had smiled. One man shot, others brought to the verge of death, one killed in the midst of his prime as a fighter, a jail broken, a town cast into confusion, and 20 men ready to take the trail for the head of Dreer. All this out of the smile of a girl. Two things connected themselves in the mind of the boy at the end of all this remembering, Jess Dreer and Mary Valentine. They were the beginning and the end. He felt that there was also a kinship between them. She was more beautiful than other women, and Dreer was stronger than other men. And surely there had been no spite or malice in Mary. He was able to recognize that at this distance. He saw that she had simply been playing a game that other people, without her will, turned into deadly earnest. Truly, it was not fair to accuse the girl, no more than it was possible to accuse Jess Dreer of sneaking crimes. A dozen times he jerked back on the reins and brought his horse to a stand as he remembered those words. "Son, are you straight?" And he had lied. Something told him that another man, the moment the first deceit was known, would have gone for his gun. But Jess Dreer had waited. He had put his trust in Carroll, and Carroll had sold him. Vaguely Joe Norman wondered how any human being could sell such a man as Dreer. His right hand tingled still, in memory, where those bony fingers had closed over it, and he felt that the glance of the outlaw, plunging into his soul, had found good metal there, and something clean, and he had been trusted for his own sake as well as for that of Carroll. His head would jerk up when that occurred to him. Suddenly he was in Salt Springs, and he was sorry. He wished that what lay before him could be postponed. He wished that the trail still stretched far ahead of him, so that he could think, his thoughts keeping time to the sway of the mustang. But now the horse was put up, and he was in the sheriff's office at the jail, with his father before him and Claney at one side. He was seeing them both in a new light, and a filmy figure was between them and him, the face of Dreer. His father took one look at him, and then growled, "Bad news." "It can't be bad news," said Claney. "He's just fagged. Sit down, Joe." And Joe sat down. His mind was working dimly, but like lightning. He was seeing many things, but none of them clearly. Chiefly he felt that what had at first been a natural thing, the carrying out of a feud, just as he had heard the family used to do in the old days in Kentucky, was now different. It was cheap, false, dirty. It was the betrayal of a fine man. "Well," said the sheriff at last, "bad news or good news? Out with it." "Bad news," said Joe slowly. "Well?" "I didn't find Dreer." That was all he could think of. It gave him a moment for further thought. "Then why the devil did you come back? Why ain't you up there looking for him?" That from his father. "I done what you told me," he said stubbornly, "and he wasn't there." "Did you ever see such a boy? And why didn't you hit his trail and find him? Afraid?" "There wasn't any trail. He ain't the kind that leaves a trail." The two older men silently glared at him. Then they stared at one another. Suddenly Claney leaned forward and stretched out his left arm on the desk. He began to count off his questions with the forefinger of his right hand, touching each of his left-hand fingers one by one, and then curling them back so that at length a clenched fist was shaking under the face of the boy. That was his attitude of public questioning. That was the attitude under which more than one sneaking cattle thief had wilted. "Where'd you go first?" "The only place there was to go." "That ain't answering me. Where'd you go?" "To the hotel." "And you asked for Jess Dreer?" "I ain't fool enough for that." His father put in, "The boy has some sense, Sheriff." "Shut up," said Claney. "I'm doing this. Well, who did you see?" "Looked over the bartenders, and picked out the wisest looking gent of the bunch. Then I stood off by myself at the bar, and fooled with my drink till he seen I was waiting for something. Finally I got him over to one side." "And asked him where Dreer was?" "Nope. I asked him where there was a game going on." "Good," chuckled the father. "Shut up," cried Claney savagely. "What did he say?" "That if I went down the hall I'd find a game. I could hear the boys talking." "What did you say to that?" "That I wanted to find a game that wouldn't make so much noise. Then he loosened up and asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted to find a gent that looked like Dreer, and I told him what Dreer looked like." "And?" "And then he looked me over for a minute, and finally he made up his mind I was on the inside, and he told me all about it. Dreer had been there playing a game pretty steady, but the day before he hit the trail." "What trail?" "I dunno, and the barkeep didn't know." "Why not?" "I dunno." The sheriff gritted his teeth. "Then we're done. The whole game's off, and Carroll is in 5,000. "Take him the letter," said Gus Norman, "and make him give back the coin." "Couldn't be worked, but I'll try. Let's have the letter, Joe." "Why, I burned the letter, Sheriff." "You what?" interrogated the sheriff angrily. "Was I going to keep packing around a letter to one outlaw that'd be about enough to hang me after the letter wasn't no good any more?" The sheriff settled back in his chair. "What did you do to it?" Gus Norman was about to explode, but the raised hand of Claney stopped him. I burned it, of course." And he fought the critical eye of the sheriff. Claney began to smile. "Joe," he said, "you've done noble, but not noble enough. You been lying." "Me?" "Don't stand up. Don't pretend to get mad. You changed color the minute I mentioned the letter, son, and I seen it. Talk turkey now. What happened between you and Dreer?" Gus Norman cursed and exclaimed, "He's been bought off. You'll forgive him if he tells us the straight of it. Now talk, Joe. You're among friends, but if you double cross us we'll make it hot for you." "It'll be the last day he spends under my roof," declared Gus Norman fiercely. "Steady, Gus. Here, Joe, have a drink. That'll help you." The nerve of Joe Norman had remained steady up to this point. The offer of the drink, the tacit assumption of friendly superiority, crumpled his powers of resistance. And all in a minute the lies of the interview were torn to pieces and thrown away. The truth was blurted from his lips, and the trap from which he had tried to free Jess Dreer was set and cocked by his own hand. End of chapters 35 and 36. Chapters 37 and 38 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. From her window, Mary Valentine watched the moon go up. She could have named every hill as the pale light picked it out, but her mind was too absent for that. Voices sounded in other parts of the house, but she heard them as from a great distance. All the world was blurred for her, and had been blurred for many days. Sometimes she found herself wondering at the change that had come over her. Sometimes she would waken in the middle of the night with an old hunted feeling. But there was nothing on which she could put her finger and say, "This or that has happened." It simply seemed that she had drifted into a new life, misted with unhappiness. No wonder, then, that the knock was twice repeated before she called, and the door opened to Morgan Valentine. He came slowly across the room to her. "Sitting here in the dark?" he asked. "It is dark. I was watching the sunset. I didn't notice how the time ran." He waited for a moment, then, "They's a caller for you, Mary." "I'm not feeling like callers, Uncle Morgan." "Honey, I wish you'd make an exception." "Well, if you wish it." She rose. After all, it made little difference, except that she had grown to have a singular preference for being alone. "I do wish it. You're going to fly out at me for asking you to see him when I tell you his name." "I won't fly out at you. I'll promise that." "Oh, girl, sometimes I almost wish you would have the old tantrums. Well, it's Joe Norman." "Joe Norman?" "There you go." I couldn't help it. Joe Norman." An intolerable disgust crept into her voice. "He's a pile changed, honey. He asked me to see Charlie first. He shook hands with Charlie, told him he knew he'd been in the wrong, that he was sorry so many things had come out of it. Charlie shook his hands right off, and now they ain't any malice between 'em. Will you see him, Mary?" "You want me to?" "I'll tell you why. I sort of feel that if you shake hands with Joe Norman and call it quits, we'll all get back to the old standing, same as we used to be before all these things happened, all these things that begun with the shooting of Joe Norman." She shook her head, but in the darkness he did not see. "I'll go out and see him, then." "Thank you, Mary." They went out through the living room. "Joe's in the parlor. He said he'd wait in there alone." Chapter 38. Mary passed down the hall and paused a moment at the door. Joe Norman was the man who indirectly had exiled Jess Dreer. But finally she opened the door and stepped in with a calm face. Joe rose to greet her. He was so changed that she almost cried out. The youthful curves were gone from his face. He seemed suddenly to have grown up. His eyes were dull and very deeply shadowed. All her anger, all her loathing, melted away. She went straight to him and took his hand. "If I'd known it would be as easy as this," said Joe Norman, smiling faintly, "I'd have come before." She brushed that remark away. "But you're changed, Joe. What happened?" She checked herself suddenly. "I was thinking the same thing," murmured Joe. "You're changed, too, Mary. Thinner, not so much color, but it sort of makes your eyes look bigger. And you're quieter, too." She was wondering why there was no sting in seeing him. "Do you know, Joe," she said suddenly, "we were both too young, and what's happened has waked us up, changed us both. If there had been any bad feeling, it's all gone now." "I'm glad to know that," said the boy soberly. "I'm leaving Salt Springs and going off. I wanted to shake hands and know that it was square between us before I started." "But where you going, Joe?" "I'm cutting loose. I don't know where I'll land." "You've been in trouble, Joe?" "Pretty bad. You see, me and my folks Well, you'll hear about it anyway, so you might as well hear it from me. We had a difference, and they sort of threw me out, Mary." "I'm sorry, Joe, very sorry." "Thanks, but between you and me I have an idea that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I was different all the time, and just lately I found it out." He began to study the floor, hunting for something to say and finding nothing, and the girl was silent likewise. "I suppose I'll be going, but we don't see you around much lately. I hear folks talking about it." "I've settled down. I stay about the house. You'd think I were waiting for something to happen to see me. Good bye, Joe." He took her hand, but at the door he turned again. "Something sort of bothers me about what you said just now, Mary. You can talk straight out to me, Joe. We're old friends. I was wondering if you really wasn't waiting for something or for somebody." She flushed at that. "You ain't mad, Mary?" "No, I guess not. What put the idea in your head?" "Well, people say a good many things. I won't believe 'em if you say they're wrong. I haven't believed 'em up till now. But what they say is that it was you that got Drear away from the house that night, and that it was because of you that Drear met—" "We won't talk about it." But he was studying her face and the pain in it. All at once he dropped his hat and took her hands. "Mary, it's true?" "About Drear. You're sort of fond of him, Mary?" No, I hardly know him." "He's the kind you only have to see once to know. I seen him once, and I know him already better'n any man I ever met. Mary, it's true. You're fond of him, sort of?" "You've heard too much talk, Joe. Forget all that." Once more he turned toward the door. When he looked back again, she caught in his face an expression of profound pity. An instinctive fear rose in Mary Valentine. She slipped between him and the door. "What's behind your questions? Tell me that before you go. Do you know something about him?" She was making no attempt at concealment now. Her heart was in her white face, in the great eyes that met the eyes of the boy, and he winced before her. "Joe!" she cried under her breath. "They've taken him. That's why Uncle Morgan and the rest have looked at me so queerly the last day or two. They've known, but they wouldn't tell me." "Mary, I swear it isn't that." "You're lying, Joe. I can see the whole truth behind your eyes. Oh, Joe, tell me what's happened. Tell me they haven't taken him." But the boy shrank from her. There was something like fear in his face. He said, wondering, "Mary, you do love him?" "I do. I'm proud of it, Joe. I love the ground he walks on, and the air he breathes. One shake of his head is more to me than all the talk I've ever heard from men or women. You see that I've humbled myself to you, Joe. I've hidden nothing. And now, be just as true to me. Tell me what you know." He shook his head, agonized. "There's nothing that can be helped. It's as good as done already." "What? For heaven's sake, what?" She stopped, her lips parted. "Joe," she whispered, "he's already dead. They've hunted him down with numbers." "No." "I can stand it, so long as I know. Anything is better than imagining." He could not speak. "Only one thing. Tell me where it was." "If I'm wrong to tell you," said the boy, "God forgive me. I've done you wrong before, Mary." "I'll forgive it all, everything that may happen. But tell me the truth, Joe." "Then it ain't happened yet, Mary. But it'll happen before morning is well on. An hour after the sun comes up. That's the time they've set." "Then why are you here? Why haven't you raised the town?" "To save an outlaw?" It crushed the words unspoken on her lips. "Besides, they kept me at home under guard for fear I'd do something. When I got out, I came here. It was too late to follow 'em when they let me loose." "When did they start?" "Late this afternoon." "And now it's night." "Yes, too late to do anything, Mary." "Where?" "Near Wendville." She ground both hands against her face. And then she heard him say, "It's too late. Even if it was day, it'd be too late, though then I might try to ride across the hills on a short cut. But by night, it'd be suicide, Mary." She had come to life suddenly. "Oh, Joe, you know that short way? Would it take me there before morning?" "Even then it'd be an hour too late, even if you killed your hoss, Mary." "But I could ride all night, and come within an hour of saving him." "Joe, You'll show me the short cut?" "I'd do more than that. I'd ride with you, Mary. I got a debt to Jess Dreer that needs payin' terrible bad. But it ain't possible, I tell you." She became calm, though her hands were shaking. "I'm going into my room to change my clothes to an old suit of Charlie's. While I do that, you go out to the barn and get the boys to saddle Uncle Morgan's gray Tom for me. You'll do that, Joe?" "Will nothing change you, Mary?" "I'm not going because I have hope, but simply because I got to do something. Joe, will you help me?" "I will." "God bless you." And she was gone through the door like a flash. End of chapters 37 and 38. Chapters 39 and 40 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. Hope is contagious. Even Joe Norman was touched by it as he hurried out to the stable. He gave the word from Mary Valentine, and it was obeyed with some hesitation, for no one on the ranch had ever heard of another person than Morgan Valentine himself riding the gray stallion. But they were accustomed to taking the word of Mary as a law second only to that of the master of the house, or even before it on occasion. So they led out Gray Tom. He was a fine fellow of 15-3, muscled beautifully for speed, with long antelope steps, and enough bone in him to write poems about, as Joe Norman himself had said. The saddle of Mary Valentine was cinched on the long back of the stallion, and then she came herself, running as freely and swiftly as a man in her boy's clothing. One word to Joe, one wave to the stableman, and they were into the saddles side by side, and off at a rattling gallop. The difference between the two mounts was at once apparent. Joe Norman rode a fine horse that would have rejoiced the heart of the most particular cattleman, a sturdy, stout-hearted, durable-legged animal with speed enough for any. But in the very beginning the cow horse was straining his utmost to keep up, and Gray Tom was running well within his strength, with a wide-stretching gallop. He carried his head high and free, while Norman's horse was stretched out straight as a string. "You'll kill your hoss before we're halfway there," shouted Joe. "Rein in, Mary, you'll kill Gray Tom." "Let him die," she answered through her teeth. "Morgan Valentine'll never forgive you. I'll live without his forgiveness. Faster, Joe." "My hoss won't stand it. He's busting himself wide open now." She looked across at the laboring animal, and at once saw the truth. If she were to keep with her guide, she would have to alter her speed, and reluctantly, with a sob breaking in her throat, she drew the rein of Gray Tom. Even then they were cutting across the hills at a dizzy rate, and Windville so many and many a mile across the broken mountains. They were striking straight for the tallest and blackest of the peaks now, and presently they dipped down a sheer bank and into the dry bed where a great river had once run. The shod hoofs of the horses beat up a terrific rattling, and the echo from the stones knocked against the banks and came back at them before and behind. It was hard going, too, with the danger always before them that one of the horses might pick up a sharp rock at any time and be rendered helpless, useless for that night's work. But Mary Valentine was setting the pace, and Joe reluctantly spurred up beside her. It was dangerous going, but the river bed gave them a perfect grade by which they ate into the heart of the high country, and Mary cried out in her disappointment when the gravel road terminated in an abrupt mound, where a landslide had buried the old bed. There was nothing for it but to hit up the slope which lay straight ahead of them. As they struck the softer soil above the bank, Mary reined in her horse and raised her hand. "Do you hear, Joe?" she whispered. "Nothing. Where?" "Out of the river bed behind us." "What?" "Listen again." He bent his ear, and now, indistinctly, he made out the far-off clattering of a horse that galloped across the pebbles. "It's Morgan Valentine," he said gloomily. "They've told him about you taking Gray Tom, and he's following you. Mary, be reasonable. Give up and go back." "I'll die first," sobbed the girl. "Come on, Joe, hurry." And she sent Gray Tom scurrying up the slope. Joe Norman followed reluctantly, shaking his head. but in this uphill going the shorter-legged mustang did far better by comparison than he had done on the level. He was made for the sweat and grind of climbing, jumping, sidestepping rocks, vaulting over fallen trees, and obstacles that maddened the high-spirited Grey Tom were taken in the most casual manner by the cow pony. It was only a brief climb to the first ridge, but when they came out on it, Joe Norman stretched out his hand and caught the reins in the hand of Mary. "Look ahead," he commanded. The girl obeyed, and her heart sank. Ridge after ridge lay before them, sharp-crested, with the rocks on the summits glittering in the moonlight, and the forest everywhere black, sombre. It was such a sight as everywhere sends the thoughts of men to the shelter of a home, and as she looked on it, despair fell on Mary Valentine. "And that's not all," said Joe Norman. "They's a lot more of it than you can see from here. We're just on the edge of it. Them ranges are like rows of teeth, and the sides of some of 'em are as slippery as teeth. Mary, give it up. There ain't any use. You'll kill Grey Tom, and you'll kill my hoss. I don't care about that if we could gain anything in the long run, but we can't. We're beat before we start. We was beat before we left the house, and I knew it, but I thought I'd come out with you and let you take the first run, so's the night wind would calm you down some, and you could see it was impossible." "Then you lied, Joe. You said it could be done by day." "I dunno. Maybe it could be done by day, but by night it's pure suicide. Will you believe me, Mary? There's slides that take your breath even when you got the sun to help you. But the moon ain't any good for ticklish work. It just shows you a pile of things that really ain't there, and the real dangers it covers up. Will you believe me, Mary, and turn back?" "Go back yourself, Joe. I'll go on. I've got to go on. But you go back, and I'll find a way." She touched Grey Tom with her spurs as she spoke, and the big stallion sprang out to the full length of his stride. He landed far down the slope, crashed upon some loose rock, staggered, and then plunged out of sight in the thicket with the noise of a living landslide. Joe Norman screamed, "Mary! You've gone mad, Mary!" Only the noise of her wild descent roared back at him. He spurred his own mustang with a shout of horror, and galloped after her, but more carefully, letting the half-wild horse have his head partly to himself, for he knew that the instinct of the brute was all that could save him from being dashed to pieces 1,000 times in such a place. No cunning of hand or sharpness of eye could warn the rider in time. It was a nightmare to Joe Norman. Somehow they came out on the clearing at the bottom of the slope, and stretching across the open ground he saw Grey Tom flash in the moonlight, and then lunge once more into the dark of the forest toward the next ridge. An exultation that was half the cold of fear ran through the veins of Joe Norman. He spurred his horse frantically, and striking the far slope at full speed, they followed the crash of Grey Tom leading the way. Close to the top he shouted again, and when he reached the ridge he found that she had reined her horse for a moment and was waiting for him. Grey Tom was panting as if he had run 20 miles. "You're killing him," he warned her. "But let him die, then. More to the left, Mary. You see that tall, bald rock? Holy Mount, they call it. Strike toward that." "Thanks, Joe. But faster, Joe. You keep me back." "I keep you back to sense. But come on." But there was no keeping the girl back. Once more she spurred Grey Tom, and once more the stallion, frantic in this wild ride, leaped out through thin air, smashed into the thicket far below, and went thundering toward the bottom of the slope. A sort of frenzy seized on Joe. With spur and quirt he sent the mustang flying down after the girl, and the wild horse went snorting, dancing like a sparring pugilist through the maze of young trees and shrubs, and coming out at the bottom almost even with Grey Tom. In the middle of the narrow valley floor Joe Norman drew rein with a low cry of warning. The girl checked her horse. "Look up and back, up to the top of the last ridge, just where we come over it." She obeyed, and distinctly outlined, black against the moonlit sky, she saw a horseman top the ridge and shoot down into the forest with a noise that came distinctly to them. "That's not your uncle, Mary. Your uncle would never ride as crazily as that. Who is it?" "I don't know. It might be Uncle Morgan, but there was something I recognized about the way he sat the saddle, sort of sidewise. But come on, Joe. Whoever he is, he can't catch us." And they drove together at the next slope. Fear was in them now, not so much of the dangerous trail which they were following, as of the unknown man who rode so desperately after them. For if he had been a friend, surely he would have tried to hail them. From the top of that last ridge he could easily have reached them with his voice, but they had not heard a sound. This slope was not so heartbreaking as the others, but nevertheless Mary Valentine kept Gray Tom in. The harshness of his breathing was beginning to alarm her, and she knew that it is possible to break the heart of a horse in a very short time if he is allowed to run himself out. So she nursed the stallion up the slope. He was in a better condition already when he reached the top, and, as they swung in a canter down a more moderate fall of ground beyond, Mary swung close to Joe. "I've remembered who that was like," she called. "The man who's following us is Sheriff Caswell." Chapter 40. It was a calamity of the first water. What was the use of riding to Jess Dreer if they brought his deadliest enemy in their wake? One hope remained, and that was to distance the sheriff and reach Jess far enough ahead to allow him to escape. So they gave their minds grimly to their work. They had not even time to talk, save a broken phrase here and there, but as the ride continued she gathered the full details of the plan of the Norman clan against Dreer. Gus Norman was to ride ahead of the rest and go straight to Dreer. There he would interview the outlaw and take him to a shack which he knew in the hills near Windville. Mary learned the location of the place by heart from Joe, who had heard Gus go over its description a dozen times to a dozen different members of the gang. He would take Jess Dreer to this ruined old cabin as to a rendezvous. Then he would leave the outlaw there, and go to meet the others under pretense of calling in the members of the crew who were to take part in the fake robbery. The moment Gus had joined the others, they would swing down around the cabin and open a plunging fire from the rocks above. If, as was apt to be the case, they did not kill Dreer at the first discharge, they would nevertheless have him in an utterly helpless position. At worst, they could easily set the cabin on fire and kill the outlaw as he attempted to flee from the cover. To make his escape entirely impossible, the first discharge would be chiefly directed against the roan mare, Angelina. On foot, Dreer's chance of a dash for liberty would be less than zero. Mary did not hear this story in one fluent narrative, but an interrupted series of explanations, exclamations, and phrases here and there gave her ample groundwork on which to build the complete picture of the plot. Sometimes, as her hatred of the whole clan of Normans swelled in her, she felt like snatching a revolver from the holsters and firing it into the breast of the man beside her. Sometimes a great wonder grew in her that out of the very list of Dreer's enemies had been furnished the man who gave life to this wan ghost of a last hope. Now the labor of the ride cut off the very possibility of thought from her mind. They had struck what Joe assured her was the longest and most severe of the hillsides that they would encounter on the entire ride. It led up to a dangerous slope beyond, generally called the Slide, on account of the precipitous angle of the drop of ground. And now Joe Norman, who had been a weight upon her spirits in the beginning, was rapidly reviving. He began to throw out hopes. Never, even in daylight, had he ever heard of such a distance through the hills being covered in such a short space of time. To be sure, the hardest part of the ride lay before them, and they would have to take it with horses completely fagged. But nevertheless there was the glimmering of the first dawn of hope. It might be done. Half the night was spent, but the other half, before that fatal time of an hour past dawn, they might reach the shack and give the warning to Jess Dreer. He told her this while the horses sweated and grunted up the long rise. Once, on a shoulder of the slope, they paused by mutual consent to give the animals a breathing space. Then, far and dim below, they heard the horse of the pursuer coming up the slope. At this they hurried on, the mustang now showing a condition fully as good as that of Gray Tom. But when they came out on the brow on the crest, Joe Norman stopped the girl with a yell of alarm. The face of the hill was dished away. It had literally disappeared, and the head of Grey Tom was hanging over an abyss. "A landslide!" groaned Joe Norman. By the moonlight they could make it out plainly now. First there was a straight fall of cliff for a dizzy distance. Below this an apron of debris was spread, covered with what seemed to be stubble in the distance, but what they knew to be the splintered hulks of trees. Even as they stood, their horses side by side, looking at one another in utter despair, the ground quivered beneath them. They were barely able to spur onto firmer ground when the entire table where they had stood before gave way, shuddered, yawned wide, and a thundering avalanche rushed down the slope. The noise of the fall died away. A thick silence fell. Then the echo from the far hillside picked up the noise and sent it rumbling and rushing back at them, as if the landslide had roused some monster in the valley and made it roar defiance. When that echo died away, they could hear another sound distinctly from the hillside behind them, the noise of the pursuer following up the slope. He would be upon them in a moment. "Quick, Joe," pleaded the girl. "What can we do?" "They's only one way out," said Joe Norman sullenly, "and that's to go back. We've had our work for nothing. I tell you there has to be a way. None in the world. Straight yonder, there's the direction for us, but we'll never get there." She swung her horse around with a cry of grief and impatience, and rode him along the ridge, desperately close to the edge of the landslide. Her shout brought Norman beside her. She was pointing down through the moonlight. "Don't you think, if we put our horses back on their haunches, they'd go down that, sliding all the way to the bottom?" He looked over and shuddered as he craned his head to look, for she was much nearer the edge on Grey Tom than he had dared to ride. At this place the landslide had not ripped away the soil to the sheer face of the rock. There was no right-angle face of stone, but a skirting of the raw dirt came up to the edge of the ridge and swept away down to the floor of the gully at a dizzy angle. Halfway down it veered out toward a more generous angle. "Mary," he said, lifting his head, "you got a pile of courage even to think of it. I'll tell you what, it'd be just the same as jumping a hoss over a cliff, except that a cliff would kill him a little quicker." "But if we had luck—" "No kind of luck would save us, Mary. Plain suicide. Suppose a hoss could keep upright sliding down, he wouldn't be able to pick his way. All he could do would be to sit back on his haunches and slide. And if he struck a big rock, or a tree stump, or anything to knock him over, why, he'd keep right on rolling over and over till he hit the bottom with a smash. He'd be dead long before that, and his rider would be just a red smear trailing out behind him." The moonlight somehow helped to paint the picture vividly. She saw herself on Grey Tom shooting down the slope, the rock lifting suddenly out of the moon haze, the crash, the toppling of the horse upon his side, and then death. Then she heard the noise of the pursuer coming up the slope, terribly near now. Fear of something behind, unknown, balanced the fear of what lay before her. "Joe," she cried, "good-bye. I'm going." "No, no, Mary!" He flung himself from the mustang and strove to reach the head of Grey Tom, but she had swung the stallion straight out to the edge of the ridge, and as Joe sprang forward he saw the ground tremble, quake, and sink down. He whirled about. He was barely in time to spring back to solid ground, and when he looked again, Grey Tom, with a snort of terror, was plunging down the slope. One thing favoured Mary, and that was the very fall of the ground, for it launched her smoothly and slowly on the downward journey. The chief trouble was that the rush of earth and stones around him maddened Grey Tom. He tried to straighten and spring away from that senseless confusion, but the girl flung herself far back in the saddle, and, throwing all her weight on the reins, managed to pry him back on his haunches, far back. He was almost sitting down. Then the impetus of the drop caught them, and they shot down. The ridge was whipped away from behind them. She looked far ahead. The distance to the floor of the gulch seemed treble as far as it had been from the top of the ridge above her. nor was the ground half as smooth as it had appeared, viewed at the close angle. There were patches of muddy clay, there were streaks of gravel, which, when they struck them, sent a raging avalanche pouring before them. But the danger was not in the speed of the slide. It lay in the projections which jagged up and back at them like shark teeth. The end of a tree stump jumped at them from the night. A ragged edge caught her shoulder and ripped the sleeve away to the wrist, and when this was past she saw a certain doom before them in the form of a big rock. There was no dodging it, and it was far too bulky to sway away from. Chance entered there and saved them. The slide had swerved on either side of the boulder, and Gray Tom, in turn, was swerved along the path of least resistance and whipped by the rock. Now they struck the apron of more level going. It spread out flatter. Gray Tom had lurched to his feet and was going at a mad gallop, floundering through loose soil, rushing on so that the air sung in the ears of Mary Valentine, and then, how, she did not know, the floor of the gulch was flat before her, and Gray Tom had drawn down to a rocking canter. He was trembling like an aspen through all his bulk, but he was unhurt. Her own blood had turned to ice, but looking back to the sickening height, she saw a tiny figure gesticulating. Then exultation swept over Mary. Her blood ran warm again. If there had been a chance before, there was a double chance now. She put the spurs to Gray Tom and rushed for the next hillside. End of chapters 39 and 40. Chapters 41 and 42 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. At the top she turned for a last look at the slide, and pausing an instant at the crest, she saw a tiny dark figure slip over the edge and go downward with bullet-like speed. Her heart rose. Was it Joe Norman? Had he taken courage by her example? The moment the thought came into her brain, she knew that it was impossible. After all, it was not in Joe's nature to rise to great emergencies. He had done his utmost in guiding her so far through the night on that dangerous course, and now he would turn back with the adventure half accomplished. In all his life he would never rise to a greater thing than that. It was Sheriff Caswell who had taken the slide. Now his horse was a dim streak crossing the floor of the gulch. Sheriff Caswell! He was one of those bulldog men who make great risks seem small, and who turn the impossible into the commonplace. She turned Gray Tom straight ahead, and began to ride like mad. Strangely enough, the fear for Jess Dreer had grown small in her mind. The one thing which she most dreaded was the man who relentlessly followed on her trail, and to get clear of him, she rode the stallion without care, without caution. She flung him at heartbreaking slopes, she rushed him down precipitous hillsides, but always looking back from crest to crest, she could see the dark figure following, but growing smaller, to be sure. Then, at length, the pursuer had disappeared. For the first time in several miles she thought of Gray Tom, and the moment she looked to him she saw that he was in a serious condition. His breath came with alarming harshness, his neck and shoulders were lathered, and he staggered under the burden of his rider. Yet he kept gallantly to his work up the slope, and when she reined him, he came up on the bit and fought her to get ahead. Only a moment of this, then his hindquarters sank. He stopped. She thought for an instant that he had stepped in a hole, until the great shuddering of his body told her what had happened. Then she sprang from the saddle, but it was far too late. Gray Tom had crumpled helplessly to the earth. She caught his head in her arms, and, as if he thought that this was a signal for him to stand up, he pricked his ears, tossed his head, and lurched forward. It was the last effort, and it broke his heart. When he struck the ground again, he was dead. Beside him the girl kneeled, and seeing his eyes dim in the moonlight, she closed the lids as though he had been a man. And truly, Gray Tom had died a man's death. She was helpless now, but in spite of her helplessness a great assurance was filling her mind. One death had been paid for Jess Dreer, and surely there must be some reward for that great effort. In her first frenzy she even dreamed that she might complete the journey in time on foot, and she ran stumbling to the next hilltop. There she paused with a cry of joy, for in the low, wide valley below her she saw the dark, huddled outlines of a ranch house and its outlying buildings. Back to the body of Gray Tom again, running now as she had never run before. She untied the girths, and after a fierce struggle was able to draw them through under the body of the horse. Then, drawing the stirrups over her shoulders, and pulling the saddle high on her back, she began climbing again at a shuffling run. A 35-pound saddle is the clumsiest burden ever invented. Even a man would have groaned under it before the walk was over, but Mary Valentine was staggering with exhaustion before she reached the door of the house. In answer to her knock and her shouting, footsteps at length ran toward her from within, and the door opened on a man in his shirt, a lantern in his hand, his feet not yet worked down in his boots. He was one of those black-haired fellows whose beards grow up to their eyes. Another time she would have been terrified by that face. Now she minded it no more than if he had been a painted thing. She told him swiftly, briefly, how her horse had dropped. She must have another. She had money to pay any price he asked, but speed was the thing she needed. The man was maddeningly slow. "Sellin' a hoss by night," he declared, "is like marryin' a girl whose face you ain't never seen." "Don't you see," she cried, "that I don't care if I'm cheated, but I want the best thing on four legs that you can give me?" "The best thing I got comes high, lady. I wouldn't take a penny under 300 for my Jerry, and I wouldn't be hungry to sell him at that." She assured him that she would add another 100 to the price if he would throw the saddle on the horse quickly and let her be off, and with this assurance the rancher came to life. 5 minutes later he came out of the corral with a long, low-built brown horse with Mary's saddle on its back. She thrust the money into his hand, and without waiting for him to count it, she was off again at full speed. Her new mount had not the reach of Gray Tom, had not the same elastic spring in his gait, but before she had gone up the first slope she was delighted with her purchase. Jerry was raised among these hills and trained to the work in them. He seemed to have eyes in his feet, and he wove among the shrubbery and trees and over the loose rocks with hardly ever a pause or a stumble. The hill ended in a broad plateau, the first level going in many a mile, and she leaned over and gave Jerry his head. He did surprisingly well in spite of his short legs, and with every jump the heart of Mary rose. It was not dawn yet. There was not even a glimmer of light in the east. Surely Windville could not be so far away. At the edge of the broad clearing she heard a neigh behind her, which Jerry answered as he ran, and looking back she saw again the same stalwart figure pursuing her, the same sidewise seat in the saddle, Sheriff Caswell. It was easy to tell what had happened. He had come upon Gray Tom, he had followed down into the valley, and arrived at the house of the rancher on her very heels. There he had changed his horse for one of the farmer's, and now he was measuring strides with her again, but on an equal basis, as fresh as the Jerry that stretched out under her. During the next half-mile she made a trail of speed, but her follower kept the pace and even gained. It told Mary Valentine, more plainly than words, that she must do something more than stretch the legs of her horse if she wished to shake off this bulldog of the trail, and she made up her mind with the cold quickness of a desperate man. She swung Jerry from the trail on which he was running at that moment, and pulling him into a thicket of brush, she drew from its case the light rifle which she always carried when she rode. With the butt snuggled against the hollow of her shoulder, and her left hand at the balance, she waited, hearing the sheriff come crashing after her. She wondered, as she sat the saddle in the patch of heavy shadow, at the steadiness of her nerves. There was not a quiver of fingers or arms. Now the head of the sheriff's horse shot snake-like from among the trees, and a second later the whole group was in view. She snapped the muzzle of her rifle up, steadied it, caught her bead, and let the rifle swing easily, following the speed of the moving horse. When she fired, the animal sprang straight up, straight down with a lurch and stagger, and then sank to the earth. The sheriff was already clear of the stirrups. She saw him run a step or two toward her, his revolver in hand, but then he paused abruptly. She had twitched Jerry round and sent him flying up the trail again. No enemy behind her now. Since the sheriff was out of the way, her mind fell back on the great duel in which she was engaged. She had a horse under her, fresh, strong, willing. She had against her the inevitable rising of the sun and the rough tract of hills and valley. One stumble might ruin her chances in the race. Yet she dared not ride with caution. A gathering chill in the air, a depression of mind, a general relaxation of nerve force, and an aching pair of eyes warned her that the dawn was coming. Looking up from a hollow, there was only the blackness of the forest above her, but topping a rise of ground she saw that the trees on the rolling horizon were jagged as teeth reaching up. They were outlined by a light from behind. It was dawn. It brought her heart up behind her teeth, knocking. Into her mind surged pictures of Jess Dreer by the fire in her home, of Jess at her window, and of the outlaw behind the bars in the Salt Springs jail, nonchalant in spite of his manacles, smiling his assurance at her. It came to her that he had never spoken to her of such things as now went hot and thick through her blood. He had remained aloof, yet she had read in his mind the unspoken things. She had raised Jerry to a murderous pace. Would he stand it? The stout mustang ran with his head well down, like a cattle horse running a dodging cow. For a horse cannot dodge well when his head is high in the air. He spread out along the ground as he gathered speed, but never once did he miss footing. Once a rotted log crushed under his heels, once a pebble rolled and staggered him, but not once was Jerry at fault. Toiling up the steep slopes, or zigzagging heavily down the precipitous mountain sides, he never once flinched from the labor. She could have blessed that honest brute heart, and she began, with the light to aid her, to help him with all her power of hand and eye. She kept well forward in the saddle to throw the weight an inch or so more toward Jerry's withers. Keeping as near as possible to the direction which Joe Norman had plotted for her, she yet was able to cut off vital angles here and there, and often swerved from the straight line to give Jerry the advantage of better ground for running. And still the light increased with terrible rapidity. She topped a rise of ground. To the right a point of flame startled her like a rising forest fire, but when she looked again she saw a regular semicircle of red. And still nothing but ragged ranges ahead of her. When would they split apart and reveal Windville? And from Windville how far to the lonely cabin? In a sudden burst of grief she clasped her hands against her breast, and the tears broke from her eyes. Chapter 42. From the broken door of the ruinous shack Gus Norman looked up to the hills. Behind them his men were gathering, drifting slowly toward the hollow between the hills and the double-eared peak which rose like a mule's head. It was a black mountain now, with the rising light of the day behind it. The sun was well up. In a few minutes now he could ride to that hollow and find his men waiting, all the proven 20 who had started on the ride. Now that he was in the place he was more satisfied with it than ever. The shack lay in a roughly cut bowl with a rim of higher ground all around that would give perfect protection to his riflemen in point-blank range of their target. Even if Dreer sought protection in the hut, having avoided the first volley, he would be a lost man. Through those rotten walls a rifle bullet would range from side to side. They could honeycomb the shack in 5 minutes of concentrated fire, half of them aiming breast high, and half shooting at the level of the floor, in case he tried to lie down. No wonder, then, that Gus was smiling when he turned back into the hut. Dreer had kindled a fire, and was warming his hands over it. He kept his face religiously toward Gus Norman. Early in the night Gus Norman had noted this. Indeed, he had had flashes of hope that events would turn out so that he could take this celebrity single-handed, and gain the glory all for himself. One moment of carelessness, and his gun would flash and speak. But that moment never came. If Dreer had to turn his head, it was only for the split part of a second before he had his eyes on the other once more. And Gus Norman began to respect his companion as much as he hated him, just as a dog, say, might respect a wolf. "The time's almost here," he said, turning from the hills. "The boys will be waiting for me up yonder pretty soon." "Rainier," answered Dreer, "the thing I don't understand is why you didn't have 'em meet here in the cabin." "Because I don't like to have 'em meet until I'm with 'em. Each one of them boys, Dreer, knows that he's to ride to the hollow yonder, and that he's going to meet me there, but about 3 of 'em don't know the others in the crowd. That's my system. I play a lone hand. I let in the other boys, one by one, on part of the game, but I keep everything dark except just the part each one is going to play." "Not a bad idea. I suppose Hank is one of the new men?" "Yep, he's new, right enough. And raw, Rainier. I'm surprised that you use a boy like that." "I'll tell you what, Dreer, I was a fool to send him to you with that letter. I might have knowed that he'd try to talk too much, or something like that. But he'd been on my hands for a long time without doing nothing. He wanted to earn his salt, so I told him to go along and fetch that letter to you. He told me it was that way, but he looked like a rat in a trap. Couldn't meet my eye. You scared him, Dreer, same as you scare most of 'em. Tell you what, when I told a couple of the boys that I was aiming to get you in on my next job, they acted like a cyclone had hit 'em. Acted as though you ate men alive." "And why the devil do you want me, Rainier?" "Because you're a good man to have, Dreer. You can keep a cool head. We'll strike up a partnership before we're through." "Not in 1,000 years. I've told you that before. I'm in on this one job, and the only reason I'm in on it is because my pal, Dan Carroll, has begged me to go through for him. After this, I'm out." "Wait till you count the easy money, Dreer. I've heard others talk like you until we've got the can opened and the stuff in our pockets. Then they change." He turned towards the door again. "I wonder if it ain't time to go now?" "You seem sort of anxious to see them boys," remarked the outlaw suspiciously. "Fact is," replied Gus Norman, "that they's a couple of 'em I ain't laid eyes on for a long time. I'm kind of homesick for 'em." He went to the wall and took down a saddle from the peg. "Well, I'm off, Dreer. Back inside of half an hour." "Take your time. But what's that?" A heavy matting of grass covered most of the valley, muffling the sound of all who approached, but near the cabin there was a gravel coating to the ground. On this gravel now came the loud clatter of a galloping horse, and rushed on the cabin. Both men faced the door, but neither of them had time to reach it, when a foaming horse lunged into view, and from the saddle leaped a slender youth, who staggered when his feet struck the ground. He recovered himself, turned towards the cabin, and Dreer saw the face of Mary Valentine. "Oh, Jess!" she cried hysterically, "I'm in time. But watch him!" There had been one convulsive movement on the part of Gus Norman, but now he apparently saw that it would be impossible for him to reach his horse and escape. He stood with a sullen face in the corner. "What's the matter, Rainier?" "Rainier!" said the girl. She entered the cabin and stood with her feet braced, her legs trembling with weariness. "He's no more Rainier than I am. Rainier is a mere robber. That man is a sneaking murderer, Jess. That's Gus Norman." My," said Jess Dreer softly, but his face was black. "I been thinking you was a little wrong, Gus Norman, but I never come within miles of guessing. Not within miles." "You got me 2 to 1," said Gus Norman, fixing his eyes on the girl. "You got me cornered. I'll talk turkey." "Not 2 to 1," said Jess Dreer. "Not by no means. One of us is a girl, Gus Norman. I'll send her out of the cabin, and you and me can finish up with a little chat, man to man, eh?" Norman's mouth worked convulsively behind his beard. For one instant his wolfish face grew so savage that it seemed he was about to draw, but he controlled himself. "No use," he said doggedly. "I won't fight you, Dreer. I ain't a trained man killer, and you know it. Nope, I ain't got you yet, but you ain't got me. I'll tell you why. The minute there's a gun fired, Dreer, them hills will come alive. There'll be 20 men come hopping for this cabin. You're a hard man, Dreer, but do you think you could get 20 fighting men?" He leered at him as he spoke. "No, son, we split 50-50. You can go out with me, and I'll call the boys off. That's square." "Except that you lie," broke in Mary Valentine. "Don't you see it in his little animal eyes, Jess? The truth is that his gang of Normans and Sheriff Claney are all cached up yonder between the ears of that mountain. They're waiting until they get the signal that you're here, and they aren't expected to be there waiting until an hour after sunrise. That was the plan." Jess Dreer watched Norman silently, and under that stare the older man backed up slowly until his shoulders struck the wall. "Just step out to my saddle and get me the coil of rope you'll find on it, will you, Mary?" She obeyed, and a minute later Norman was trussed beyond hope of movement. "I'd ought to kill you, Norman," said Jess, "but I leave butcherin' for the slaughter-houses." He turned to the girl at last. Until now he had given her not a word of welcome, but now, as his glance went slowly, leisurely over her, words became too light for use. Her hair had fallen loose under the brim of her hat. From one white arm the sleeve had been torn, and now she was shrinking into the shadow as if ashamed of her man's dress. "Mary," he said at last, "what have you done for me?" "It was the short cut that brought me here. I thought it was too late when I got the news. But now I'm here, Jess, and you're safe. I've been thinking on the way. I've been seeing you dead. You see? You seem more of a ghost than real right now." He raised his hand to stop her, growing thoughtful, and his lean face puckered until one might have thought that he was becoming angry. "You rode through the mountains from the ranch? You did it at night?" "There was the moon, and almost as bright as day, Jess." He shook his head. "I didn't know there was any women like you, Mary. I didn't know there was even any men. But stay away, Jess, stay away. I'm afraid of you. Don't come stalking at me like that." "I was going to shake hands," said Jess Dreer, "to show the world in general, and mostly to show you, that Jess Dreer has a pal at last. And heavens, girl, but I've led a lonesome life." A smile began to tremble on her lips. Surely she had never been so lovely as she was now, in the shadow, in those ragged clothes, but the hand which she extended toward him was arrested halfway. "Jess!" she screamed, looking past him. "Caswell!" He whirled as the first word left her lips. Whirled toward Caswell, who stood, gun in hand, at the door. And the marvel of it was that he was able to get his gun from the holster and fire before Caswell could send home his shot. He fired, and the sheriff wavered as though he had been struck with a fist. Then his own gun spoke, and there was a clangor of steel. The revolver flew out of the hand of Jess Dreer, struck the wall, and dropped with a clatter on the floor, while Jess Dreer stood staring stupidly down at his disarmed hand. Mary, with a wail of terror, caught out her own weapon, but the slow voice of Dreer stopped her. "Put away that gun, Mary. You see, Caswell ain't like that thing in the corner. He's a man, and he won't fight a woman. So just put up your gun. I reckon this little play is all over." End of chapters 41 and 42. Chapters 43 and 44 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43. She hesitated, and then obeyed. "It isn't possible," she moaned. "He can't be here." Sheriff Caswell stepped through the door, his left arm dangling oddly by his side. "To tell you the truth," he said quietly, "a couple of times during the ride it didn't look no ways possible to me either. Once when we come to the slide, and then when you shot my horse." He shook his head. "That wasn't hardly fair play, but then I never see a woman that wouldn't shave pretty close to the shady side of things. This is how I'm here. I went back to the ranch after you drilled my hoss, and got another, and my second hoss was some piece of deviltry and leather. There wasn't no wear out to that hoss, but I wore him out anyways. He dropped a while back, and I come on by foot, and staged this little surprise party just when I'd give up my last hope. Jess, I'll trouble you to go over there and cut my friend Norman loose. I see you've been entertaining him a plenty." Without a word Dreer obeyed. At the touch of his knife the rope fell apart, and Gus Norman rose. He showed no exultation because of the presence of the sheriff. In fact, he hated the man who had seen him tied and helpless. "Looks like you're making ropes popular for clothes, Jess," went on the sheriff. "First it's Claney, now it's Norman. If you don't mind, I'll give you the same sort of a rig, unless you'll give me your parole, partner." But Dreer smiled. "Of course I'm a goner. I've always felt, Caswell, that if you ever got your teeth into me the game would be up. And now I suppose it is, but I'll keep trying." The sheriff sighed. "All right, Jess, then it's the rope, which I hate to use 'em on a man-sized man. Norman, will you oblige me by slipping a couple of nooses around Dreer's arms and legs?" The other spoke for the first time. "Partner," he said viciously, "there's one thing that would put him out of trouble. Why not try it and save the rope?" He touched his revolver significantly. "You do what I say," said the sheriff. "I don't need no suggestions." So Gus Norman went ahead sullenly with the work of tying Dreer. Presently the sheriff spoke again. "You needn't sink them nooses into the flesh, Norman." "Thanks," and Dreer nodded. "And now, if you'll take the ladies' guns, I'll be real obliged, Norman." "Thanks." He added to Mary, "You might get careless. I've seen it happen." He sat down cross-legged on the floor. A great spot of red was growing and spreading around his left shoulder. "Now, Norman, just cut away my shirt and make a bandage for this shoulder of mine. Then ride into Windville and send out a buckboard, so we can all go in together." "You mean you're going to trust Dreer to another jail?" He added softly, "He's worth just as much dead as he is alive, Sheriff." "Listen," murmured Caswell, "you're getting me real peeved, Norman. In the first place, I don't like the way you say it. Second place, I don't like the thing you say. Dreer is going to stay alive till the judge hands him the rope. Now, do what I say. You can be back here in 2 hours. I'll take care of 'em in the meantime." And Gus Norman, with a black face, obeyed, and drew the bandages, which they improvised hastily around the sheriff's shoulders. A moment later he was on his horse and clattering away. "So here we are," murmured Jess Dreer. "Mary, could you do me a terrible big favour?" She had been sitting with her head bowed in her hands, trembling. "Yes," she murmured. "Wonder if you'd be any hand at rolling a cigarette?" "I've done 'em for the boys often. Yes." "Pocket of this shirt is where the makin's are." She took out the papers and tobacco. "And one thing more. Smile for me, Mary." It was a white caricature of a smile with which she obeyed him. She said nothing while she rolled the cigarette, placed it between his lips, and lighted it. He thanked her with a nod. "Are you in a pile of pain, Sheriff?" "Not me, Jess. I'm comfortable well enough. Besides, it's only a couple of hours to wait." "Less'n that. Norman ain't going to town. He's got his gang and Claney cached away up at the hills yonder. He'll be back with 'em inside an hour and a half, or less." "But how can they move me without a buckboard? I can't sit a saddle with this." "It ain't you they're worryin' about. They're thinking about me. Steady, Mary." "Yes," she whispered, and set her teeth. The sheriff looked from one to the other with a frown. Then he shook his head. "May I ask one thing?" "1,000, Caswell, and welcome. Where was you and the girl figuring to head together?" "I don't know," said Jess Dreer, as though the thought had just come into his head. "What was we figuring on, Mary?" She could not speak, but a pitiful ghost of a smile came on her face, and went out again as she looked at him. "There ain't any use of feeling cut up, Sheriff. It was simply the end of my luck. The old gun went back on me." "Went back on you? Jess, that was the neatest snapshot I ever seen. There I was, standing with the gun in my hand, and yet you beat me to the shot." Maybe it looked that, but as a matter of fact she hung on the holster, and when I got the gun on you at last I had to hurry the shot. 1/100th part of a second more, I'm sorry to say it, Caswell, and you'd have been dead as 1,000 years ago." The sheriff moistened his pale lips. "I kind of half believe you, Jess, but then wasn't it luck for you that my shot hit your own gun instead of hitting you?" "It wouldn't have hit me. My gun was 2 inches away from my side. That snapshot of yours was traveling wide, Caswell, when it hit my gun. No, I figure the luck was with you." The sheriff cautiously raised the back of his hand that held the gun, and wiped the perspiration from his forehead. He shifted his position a little to one side, so that he could look at a more favorable angle on the girl, but as he did so, forgetfully he threw his weight on his left arm. There was no muscular reaction, of course, but the bones of the arm shoved up against the injured shoulder and strained heavily against the bandage. The sheriff, white with pain, settled suddenly back in the shadow. "That hurt you, Caswell?" "Not a bit, Jess. Just a twinge, that's all." but a moment later he knew that he had belied the situation. The strain had loosened the bandage at the same time that it opened the raw wound, and when the pain subsided a little he was aware of something hot running down his side in a steady trickle. He tried to raise his shoulder so that the bandage would press again on the wound and cut off the bleeding. It was no use. With a touch of coldness he realized that an hour at least must run before Norman returned, and in the meantime what might not that steady flow do to him? It would render him helpless as a woman. As the simile occurred to him, he looked at the girl. Ay, more helpless than this girl, certainly, who had ridden with the daring of more than most men that night. Dreer himself was securely bound, but what of the girl? How would he disarm her in the same manner? "Jess," he said, "they's one thing I want to ask." "Fire away, Sheriff," replied the outlaw, maintaining his unvarying good nature. "I could 'a' had Norman tie the girl, you know." "Sure, I know it." "And if it come to a pinch, I'd sort of run agin nature for me to fight a woman, Jess." "I know that. You're white through, Caswell." "Well, then, all I ask is that you won't let the girl help you no way to escape." "I'll promise I won't take no help from her." "Don't!" cried Mary Valentine suddenly. "Don't say it, Jess. I tell you something's happening, and he knows it. He knows it." The sheriff grinned feebly at her. "I know it, Mary Valentine, but he's promised." "You tricked it out of him." "You got something to learn, lady," answered the sheriff. "No matter how you get it, Dreer's word is good as gold. I'm going fast, but mind you, Jess, not a finger of help from the girl." "What the devil is the matter?" cried the outlaw. "What's got into you, Caswell? You look like a ghost." "Look!" He swayed over and showed a thin pool of crimson beside him. His smile was ghastly. "I bursted her open again." Jess Dreer groaned. Then, "Caswell, you fool, would you die like this?" "I dunno, Jess. Yep, I'd put death under taking you. I've got you, son, and I'll die sooner than let you go loose." "Let's dicker, Caswell. Mary, here, will bandage you up so's you'll be safe. There ain't any danger of that bleedin' can be stopped. You're safe, and you let Mary cut my ropes." The sheriff sighed, and then shook his head. "Here I stay," he said, "living or dead, and there you stay, Dreer, until they come for you." CHAPTER 44 A silence fell between them, and the bright, desperate, hopeful eyes of Mary Valentine went from one to the other. She had risen to her feet. The head of the sheriff sagged. He jerked it straight again with a mighty effort. "Your oath, Dreer," he said hoarsely. "Yes, I intend to stay by it. I'll take no help from her. But if you won't make an exchange, then Mary'll fix you up anyway. Mary, tie up his shoulder again. Caswell, you're going under." The sheriff turned his shadowed eyes upon the girl with a last appeal. "Will you do that?" he asked. "And let Jess die?" said the girl. "Trade you for him?" "There's no question of a trade," broke in Dreer. "I'm a goner, anyway. There's no chance for me to get loose without the use of my hands or my feet, and without your help. There's no question of an exchange. It's only a matter of saving the sheriff." "If he drops," said the girl, very white of face, "then you can try to get away. As long as he has his sense and that gun, you haven't a ghost of a hope. I won't raise a hand for him, Jess." "Caswell, won't you talk to her?" "I've never begged for bread or money," said the dauntless sheriff, "and I won't start now begging for my life." "Then I command you, Mary, do you hear me? I command you to give Caswell a hand." "I won't do it, Jess. That's flat." "Ain't you got a drop of mercy in your body, girl?" "Not for your enemies, Jess. Not a drop. I'll tell you a thing I never thought to talk about. It was Caswell that gave me the watch spring that gave me the chance to break away from the jail. He saved my life once. I got a life that I owe to him. He wouldn't let the dogs take me. He took his own chance. And now he's got me in a fair and square fight, the first time any man on earth ever did. Mary, for heaven's sake, be a woman. Go help him." "You can break my heart, Jess, but you can't budge me with your talk. You're more to me than he is." "It's a question of what's right, not one man agin another. Girl, I tell you he's always played fair on the trail. He's never once used a dirty trick agin me." "No," she said faintly, "I won't raise a hand." Jess Dreer groaned, for the sheriff, the gun falling from his hand, lurched suddenly sideways and lay on the floor. There was a hoarse cry of satisfaction from Mary. She ran to Jess, whipping out and opening her pocket knife as she came. He stopped her with a shout. "Keep off! If you touch the ropes, Mary, I swear I won't stir after my hands are free. I won't stir. He has my word, Mary, and my word stays good, whether he lives or dies." "You're mad, Jess. It's your chance. Our chance together. Oh, Jess, is your word worth more to you than I am?" She was on her knees, imploring him, wet-eyed, and the face of Jess Dreer turned grey with pain. "Ay," he said slowly, at length, "worth more to me than all the men in the world and all the women. I've got myself the name of a murderer and a robber girl. What have I got left except my own honour?" "Who knows it? Who gives you credit for it? Who in the wide world would believe what you're doing now?" "Me and God know it," said the outlaw quietly. She changed her tactics swiftly. "Are you going to give up like a woman, Jess? Aren't you going to make one try for your life? Aren't you going to fight? Aren't you going to use your own strength, even if you won't let me help?" "Tear off the old bandage and put a new one on Caswell, and I shall." "What if he comes back to life? What if he comes out of his faint?" "We'll risk it." She obeyed him then, with frantic haste, first casting one glance through the door, and then seeing no sign of horsemen sweeping down the long hillside. Seconds were worth hours now. The old bandage was ripped away under her knife. She tore off her own outer skirt, and after tearing it to strips and knotting them together, she managed to make the bandage strong and firm, and the welling of the flow ceased. The sheriff still breathed, though faintly. "Jess, now yourself." But he was already at work. He had planned it swiftly while she worked over the sheriff. Had there been a single cutting instrument in the cabin, so much as a blunt-edged mud scraper at the door, he could have in time frayed the ropes that held him. But there was nothing he could use. His own knife was in his pocket, but how could he reach it without the use of Mary's hands? If there was no steel to cut the ropes, there was at least the fire. But how to reach it? He had no use of his hands to get out the coals, even if the few sticks in the flimsy old stove had not already burned away to ashes. He reached his decision at last. Squirming across the floor, he planted his shoulders, swung up his legs, and with one strong thrust of his feet brought down the old stove in a clattering ruin. A faint smoke went up from the fragments. He scattered the iron parts, still using his bound feet, for his hands were tied together before him, and the elbows were made fast against his sides. The iron was knocked away, but now there was not a trace of a coal. He swayed to his knees and searched, with Mary leaning beside him, desperately questioning him as to his purpose, and getting no answer. And then he found it, two small, swiftly darkening bits of wood coal. He blew on them, and the red returned. Yet this alone was not enough. He must have fuel. With terrible labour he worked across to the sheriff, tore open his coat, and drew out a packet of letters and loose papers with his teeth. Then, with his prize in his mouth, back to the coals. Over them he piled the papers, and then began to blow. But it seemed that the contact with the cold paper had completely taken the life from the coals. He blew, but there was no answering upward trickle of smoke. He blew again, and now a faint pungent odour came to his nostrils. He blessed it with a cry, and in a moment the paper blackened, curled back, and a tongue of flame went up. Over the papers now he scraped with his feet the remnant of the wood. The loose ends, in turn, took the blaze and crackled. That done, he got again to his knees and held his bound hands over the point of the flame. If the ropes had held them further apart, it would have been a simple matter to burn the ropes away, but the wrists were hardly an inch apart, and to ignite the cords he had to sear his own flesh. And there was Mary Valentine on her knees beside him. Her teeth were set when his teeth set. Her head turned back in agony when he groaned, and a horrible sickening odour of burned flesh rose to them. And then the cords caught fire. Slowly, very slowly. It was maddening to see them blacken, char, before they caught the yellow flame. But at length they were afire. He strained his wrists. One cord parted with a faint snap. Mary Valentine cried out hysterically with joy. Then a voice called from the corner of the cabin, "Dreer! Jess Dreer!" They turned. The sheriff had regained his senses. He sat with his back braced crookedly against the wall, an expression of half drunken determination and agony on his face, and the revolver in his hand. "I've seen you, Dreer, and I can't stop you, but the law says, alive or dead, and dead you shall be." He raised the gun, grinned with effort as he deliberately sighted it, and then crumpled again on the floor. The last of the cords parted, and Jess Dreer shook away the smoking fragments. "But they're coming, Jess!" cried the girl at the door. "They're coming fast! Look!" Far off, streaming down the hillside, he saw the cavalcade, but they came leisurely. What call was there for hurry? First, Caswell. He took the sheriff under his arms, he could feel the slow heart beat as he did it, and bore him through the door. Then he swung into the saddle at the same time that the spreading fire in the shack ran up the wall with a great crackling. The smoke and the flame had been a signal to the posse. It came now on the dead run. He could tell, even at a distance of 1.5 miles. "Is your horse good for anything?" "A little. He was played out, but he's tough as leather." "Then ride on first. I'll drop behind a little and keep 'em off till they should press us." "Not in 1,000 years, Jess. Besides, the cowards won't dare to press Jess Dreer on an open trail. I know 'em." He answered her with a smile. "How far do you think, Jess Dreer?" "To the end of the world, I reckon." "We won't argue the point," said Mary. And they cut up the slope at a sharp gallop and dipped over the rim side by side. End of chapters 43 and 44. End of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand.